Thank you, Dr. Together for, I don't know, 20 years it seems like. And I'm really happy that everybody's here today. And going through this process of healing is important. I too have the same experience of being a historian and having to uncover wounds. Sometimes I'll give talks. First of all, let me, I'm not sure how to find my,
Here.
thank you. No, that's not.
Oh, it's, I see it.
Yeah, yeah. It's this one. Yeah, the importance of finding ways to deal with the wounds, and sometimes as historians it seems like we're doing the opposite. I've been a musician for many years, and I kind of gave it up when I was doing my PhD. And I've returned to it because I think it's music, poetry is powerful. I'm reminded of the words of Howard Zinn, who says, "They have the guns, we have the poets, therefore we will win." And I think that's what Dr. Lebo was talking about in terms of that's a powerful form of resistance, and our city has responded that way. It's responded to destruction with creation. But I think what historians do is also important, and we do uncover the wounds. And I've been to places where I'll give talks about very evil history, and it is uncovering the putridness, the stench, the pus, the ugliness of what our communities have gone through. They say, "Why do you want to bring this up?" But we have to. That's the way to heal. When this happened, politicians when the El Paso massacre took place, politicians stood in front of the cameras like they usually do, and they had all their responses, and some of them said, of course, that it was video games and mental illness that caused this, and Trump said that it was the lack of a wall. If we build a wall, then you won't have all these extremists. And then there were other things, the gun control, which is important, of course. Other people said Trump, and of course, he's a huge part of what's going on. But I think the roots are much deeper, and we need historians also, as we need poets to look at those roots, to come up with a diagnosis of what happened. So right now, I've been working on a book for too long, and part of the title is Intelligence and Propaganda on the U.S.-Mexico border as the production of border invasion anxiety. So what I do is I'll go to places, and just recently I was back in Berlin, and I spent a lot of time in Berlin looking at German intelligence and propaganda reports in Mexico City, Allied Axis propaganda reports during the 1930s and 1940s, when the rise of fascism, global fascism, was very strong. And so the first moment that I see the El Paso Shooters Manifesto, I got like a chill, because I look at these kinds of documents, and I'm very literal. I'll take it sentence by sentence, and I'll try to figure out, what each sentence means on the surface, and where it's coming from, what's the context. And that's kind of what I'm going to do today, in a very literal sense, but also literary in the sense of the literature that's behind the El Paso Shooters Manifesto. So I called, my subtitle to this is a history of white supremacist violence against Mexicans and Mexican Americans on the U.S.-Mexico border. So remember, we all know there were 8 victims from Mexico, and the rest were, the majority were, I think all of them were Mexican Americans or Mexicans, because the shooter said, I want to kill Mexicans. He told that to the police. But if you read his manifesto, he makes no distinction. And I think that's an important part of the healing process. We have to stop making distinctions as fronterizos between people that are on one side of the barbed wire fence and the other, because I think that's part of the psychological warfare operation that has been going on the border. That's part of the border war. Shoot, I don't know how do you forward?
The arrows on the keyboard.
This one. Oh, there it is. So here's the El Paso Shooters Manifesto, and I am going to take it just sentence by sentence. So he starts out, this attack is a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas. And of course, that's so problematic right there. I mean, that's the story. Oh dear, I don't even think I have to go there. They are the instigators, not me. Sounds a lot like abusers, which is kind of what Trump said, you know. You guys won't fund my walls, that's why people are doing this. I am simply defending my country from cultural and ethnic replacement brought on by an invasion. My motives for this attack are not at all personal. Actually, the Hispanic community was my target before I was not my target. Oh, I'm sorry, that was a misspell, a typo there. It was not my target before I read The Great Replacement. So what is he talking about? The Great Replacement. It's a conspiracy theory about the genocide of white people around the world. And it was by a French fascist who wrote this book, Le Grand Replacement, Renaud Camus. And in his case, the white people around the world were going to be eliminated in France, specifically by the Muslims, by the Arab world. So that's the first thing that's underneath this manifesto. Even though new migrants do the dirty work, their kids usually don't. They want to live the American dream, which is why they get college degrees and feel higher paying skilled positions. So once again, for the shooter, there was no distinction between whether you had papers or not, what side of that fence you were born on. Mexicans is kind of a generic term for him. You know, Hispanics, Mexicans, he uses those interchangeably. The Hispanic population is willing to return to their countries if given the right incentive, an incentive that means that I and other patriotic Americans will provide. I'm so sorry. All of this is very new research, obviously. It's not something that's quite that polished yet. But yeah, that's interesting. He thinks there's an incentive. What does he mean by incentive? Well, terrorism, right? The psychological warfare that is inherent in kind of the terrorist action that he's carrying out. Hispanics will take control of the local and state government of my beloved Texas, changing the policy to better suit their needs. And of course, all of this is part of the alt-right. You hear that in so many conservative talk shows. Our European comrades don't have the gun rights needed to repel the millions of invaders that plague their country. So this is very interesting. Of course, he sees himself as part of a global movement. So what's really interesting about this document is that this is a 21-year-old, college, a community college student that writes a document that doesn't sound like, it's incoherent in some ways, but it doesn't sound at all like the rantings of a madman. If you look at it, it's kind of surprising that there are no major obvious typos. I mean, I included typos, but he does not. So you're thinking, can somebody else, help him with this? Are there other readers? Is this a collective manifesto and not just a manifesto of one person? So it is part of a global movement that he's referring to. And of course, the Norwegian shooter, he referenced the El Paso shooting, and the Australian shooter references Trump. 71% of a lot of these mass shootings in the United States in the last several years have been by white supremacists. And they often mention some kind of manifesto that they find in these sites that are highly frequented by white supremacists. And then he says, I can't bring myself to kill my fellow Americans, even if they are shameless my misspelling, not his, race mixers. I am against race mixing because it destroys genetic diversity and creates identity problems. Second and third generation Hispanics form interracial unions at much higher rates than average. Yet another reason to send them back. So this idea of racial purity, racial mixing, it's very much part of the alt-right, what's now seen as accelerationist philosophies of the white supremacist groups that I'll talk about a little later. My opinion on immigration and the rest, my opinions on immigration and the rest predate Trump. And that's true too. So the solution is not only getting rid of Trump, although that's going to be an important part of it, because these ideas have been around for a long, long time. This is just the beginning of the fight for America and Europe. Once again, this is a global ideology. So, pretty chilling, right, when you read that and you see the effects of what these ideologies produce. White supremacist accelerationism. So there's this whole movement called accelerationism, and these are the objectives. Create an ethno-state in which at least 90% of the inhabitants are white through the following measures. Draconian border enforcement measures to deter future migration, mass deportations, revocation of birthright citizenship, purging non-white children. This part is the most chilling, and it kind of reminds you of the detention centers here in Tornillo, because they supposedly represent the greatest threat of this conspiracy theory, the genocide, the disappearance of the white race. And finally, employment of very strategic terror tactics and violence to accelerate the elimination of non-whites from this country. So you see these, if you go into these kind of white supremacist groups, you'll see these kind of statements in the comment section. Random violence is not detrimental to our cause, because we need to convince Americans that violence against non-whites is desirable, or at least not something worth opposing anyways. Because there is no way to remove 100 million people without a massive elements of violence. And this was written by, in the Daily Stormer, one of these websites, and he was commenting in an approving way of what happened in El Paso on August the 3rd. But is this all fringe stuff that's going on? No, not at all. The first, the person that planted the seeds on accelerationism was Julius Evola. He's an Italian neo-fascist that was seminal in a lot of the kind of intellectual foundations of the alt-right, the neo-Nazis, the white supremacist organizations. And, I mean, everybody, when they see Trump, everybody thinks this guy's a clown. He's not an intellectual at all. And he's not. But we also have reports back in the 90s that he had Hitler's speeches on his stand, and he would kind of say, yeah, I've read Mein Kampf. So you don't know if Trump is capable of such kind of sophisticated intellectual kind of thinkings, right? But the people around him are, and it's been documented that Julius Evola is an influence in some of the people around him, like Stephen Miller, one of his most important current advisors, who is really behind all these draconian immigration kind of blitzkriegs against their communities. And of course, Steve Bannon. There's quite a bit of documentation that Julius Evola, whose writings basically emphasize the need to accelerate, to intervene, to bring this white ethno-state to fruition. So there are connections, but they go much, much deeper, and this is where now I get into history. One of the first, these ideas didn't start with neo-fascism in either in Nazi Germany or in Italy or fascism. They started here in the United States, the eugenics movement. I mean, perhaps it didn't start here, but it was one of the it was at the forefront of this movement to create a master race. And Mexicans were always integral to Mexicans, and Mexican Americans were always integral to that battle for that production. So this is a quote from his famous book, The Passing of the Great Race, and it's a book that Hitler himself considered as his Bible. The Mexican Indian has no racial qualities to contribute to the United States population that are now needed, Grant asserted. He recommended that Mexicans in the United States should be deported as fast as they can be located and funds made available, despite the likelihood that a storm of protest will arise from the radicals and half-breeds claiming to be Americans, who will all rush to the defense of their kind. So that kind of stuff, I mean, that was said in 1916, right? But it could be Trump saying that today. So what was part of this eugenics movement? It was not at all a fringe movement. I mean, it was like the leading intellectuals, economic, political classes, the elite were behind eugenics. And so the idea was that you were going to racially cleanse U.S. cities, the country, the body politic, through progressive era ideas of reducing the numbers of undesirable aliens and those deemed unfit. And these were going to be the methods that they were going to use: draconian immigration restrictions, forced sterilization, birth control, massive incarceration, slum clearance, urban removal, miscegenation laws, and scientific baby contests as a means to purify Americans' Nordic racial stock. So here's some pictures of those baby contests. And while looking at the El Paso Times, El Paso Herald, there were these scientific baby contests here in El Paso as well, right? That they would get a little certificate because they fit what was the ideal kind of qualities of a baby.
There's a Jew and an Irish one, baby there.
Really?
How can that be?
Good question. Very good question. And so in my own research, of course, I look at the connection with these ideas and the effect here on the border. So the Santa Fe International Bridge, there was a terribly humiliating process that border crossers had to go through. They would have to strip naked and go through all kinds of racial cleansing, purification rituals with very, very noxious pesticides that were used directly on their bodies and also on their clothing. So here's one of the steam dryers that people would have to take off their clothes and put them through these steam dryers. Sometimes they would melt their shoes. And here they are at the Santa Fe Bridge. So the Santa Fe Bridge is the same place where today you see all those pictures of concentration camps, basically people behind barbed wire, same exact bridge. And of course, racial cleansing also included, in this case, getting rid, leveling, raising acres and acres of South El Paso in the Segundo Barrio and First Ward. So of course there's association between what the city is doing today in Duranguito and what it did back in 1916, a little over 100 years ago. And so this is one of the pieces of evidence documentation that I found when I was doing my first book on the connection between Nazi Germany and here, the U.S.-Mexico border. And it wasn't so much that the U.S. or this country was imitating what Nazi Germany was doing, because this is from 1937. It's part of an article by Dr. Gerard Peters, who is looking at the El Paso example of how they're using this pesticide called Cyclone B to disinfect the clothing of border crossers. So it was the other way around. It was Nazi Germany that was looking at the United States and kind of implementing some of their policies, and even in this case, their pesticides. So this is an ad from that same magazine that had the pictures of the El Paso disinfection plant. And it says, "Wir stellen die Einwanderung schädliches Insekten." We are embargoing, shutting down the borders to the Einwanderung, to the immigration of harmful pests. So Nazi Germany at that time had this policy called Einschaltung, where everything was kind of coordinated to the National Socialist policies. So when they're talking about pesticides and they show different crossings on the border where Cyclone B is going to be used. So this is 1937, before the final solution is instituted. So it wasn't used yet in concentrated doses to kill millions of people, as it was in Auschwitz later. At that time, it was just used primarily as a pesticide, exactly how it was being used here in El Paso. So that's a photograph of Dr. Gerard Peters.